Thanks for tuning in to Discover Stories on Reimagine Radio. Before we get started, here's a word from our sponsor.
Do you wish you had a voice in making some of the world's most popular websites more accessible? Fable is recruiting a community of paid assistive technology users who work from home to test websites and provide feedback on how they can be improved. We're currently recruiting testers who use Dragon, voice control, eye tracking, switch controls, and head mice. No resume, no cover letter, and no experience with user testing is required. Learn more and apply at www.makeitfable.com/community.
Hello, and thank you for tuning into Discover Stories with Reimagine Radio. My name is Tanya, your host and a student intern with VAMS while completing my social justice practicum. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of talking with Amy Amantea. Amy is a white settler on the stolen lands of the Squamish, Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh First Peoples, colonially known as Vancouver, BC. Living with blindness, neurodivergence, chronic pain, and chronic illness, Amy aims to increase representation of disability within the Canadian theatre landscape. Her background is in acting, having attended VFS and private acting academies before her sight loss. Amy has had to reinvent herself as a performer and integrate access, advocacy, and activism into her work. Amy also works as a consultant and strategist around access in the arts, exploring both traditional access conventions through service providers, as well as creative access provided directly from the artist and immersed into the work. Amy's most recent work is Through My Lens in partnership with Theatre Replacement, which explores her intersection of photography and blindness. This work was presented at the FoldA Festival in Kingston in 2023, at the Hold On Let Go Festival in Vancouver in 2024, and the Undercurrents Festival in Ottawa in 2024. Hi, Amy. Thank you for joining me in this conversation today.
Oh, thanks, Tanya. I'm really tickled to be invited.
Oh, amazing. You've been on the podcast before, and we're just so happy to have you again because there's just so much I feel like we can learn from your experience as well as your advocacy and the ways you weave these two together within the arts.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing as an artist because art is supposed to make us have conversations. Sometimes conversations around really difficult things. And I guess when I was a typical TAB, a temporarily able-bodied person before my experience of disability, I didn't really think about, what advocacy looks like in my art practice. But certainly once I had lived experience of disability, that changed everything for me. And then it was all about advocacy and education and lived experience. And sometimes I call my practice edutainment. How much am I educating and how much am I entertaining audiences?
Absolutely.
But I can't separate, the advocacy and the education from the art because those things are all ingrained in me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And just even the idea of including another person who represents a even bigger community that in many ways is marginalized. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the disability community. Just being included in the arts and seeing them or experiencing their work is just such an affirming experience. I also take it.
Well, I think, when I go back to my days as a TAB, it was really easy to see myself represented on stages, on film, in television. I was 24 when I lost my sight. So I, essentially lived a whole life before sight loss. As a white, cis woman, I, could turn on any TV or any movie and see other white cis people in their 20s. So there was representation of that demographic everywhere, of those intersections everywhere. But then once disability came into my life in multiple intersections, as you read in my bio, there was no representation, or I should say authentic representation of blindness, of disability that I could point to and say, hey, look, that is what my life is like. That is what my story is like. That is what everyday life is like for me. Not always like, oh, poor them, they have a disability and it's because of this tragedy, right? Like we get up, we go to work, we live everyday lives like everyday people do because we are everyday people. Right. We're 27% of the population. And so this idea of authentic representation and seeing ourselves reflected in our stories, that is so important for every human being, for every equity-seeking person. Absolutely. If we don't know that we belong and we don't feel like we belong in these stories, then we don't, I would never have thought that I would have belonged on stage had I not found that there were people telling their stories from the disability community. And I imagine there are other people that live with various disabilities who are saying the same thing. Well, my stories aren't being told, so I obviously don't belong here. The world's telling me my stories aren't important.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're also paving the way for that too, like for more stories to be included in this landscape.
I hope in my small way, I'm opening doors through one, the work that I do, two, the artists that I work with in general, because I also think that sometimes what happens is when people don't work with us, and by us I mean folks in the disability community, they forget about us. I see that even in, if I go into an organization to work in accessibility and they, for example, give me my intake package and it talks about, what we do in case of an emergency, for example. And they say things like, oh, well, you can't take the stairs and the muster station is across the street, up a set of curbs and into the grassy park area. And you're like, that's nice. How do I, evacuate the building if I use a wheelchair or if I'm blind? How do I find these things? Yeah. And they're like, oh, we never thought about it before because we didn't have people with disabilities working for us.
Right.
And that's essentially part of the issue, which is when we're not in people's spaces, they forget about us. And how do we make people remember that we are a part of the fabric, a part of the community, even if we're not in their workplace at the time, that they're writing policies, that they're creating whatever that they're creating. And so in working with individual artists, how do you make your work accessible if you don't live with a disability? How do you think about creative access in your work? How do you invite people from the disability community to come and work with you and be actors in your work and, invite that process in, because that perhaps you may have an audience member who identifies with disability. You don't know who's going to come to your audience, but also those of us who work in theater, I lovingly call us misfits because we all were looking for a place to belong, right? We all came from different walks. We all know what it's like to be a little bit othered. We're all looking for a place to belong. I love the word misfit in the most loving way. So why would we want to withhold the joy of theater from anybody? So thinking about these kinds of things, I always say access begins with A. We think about it from the beginning of the process. And that's so much easier when you're working with individual artists than you are with the big machine of a big arts company.
Of course.
So I hope through some of this work, it percolates. Yeah. And, artists are like, oh, I worked on this one project with Amy. And even though she's not performing, she's helping us with the access or the creative access piece. We can take that knowledge into the next work and the next work and the next work and people we work with. And so it helps to, grow and plant those seeds. That's my hope. And some of the artists that I work with are so interested in the access work and even more the creative access, which is not necessarily hiring, an ASL interpreter or hiring audio describers or the service providers, but working with community to build in something that is maybe more experimental. That's just why we call it creative access. So sometimes I call myself a creative access thought leader because I'm really good at trying to come up with a creative thing to try and see if it works.
Yeah, I'm wondering also so that people who are tuning into this podcast may have a better idea. Is there an example that you can give us where you weaved in creative access into the work of an artist?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. Creative access can look like anything you want it to look like. So I think probably folks know what a service provider where you would hire a third party service to come in and provide the service.
Yeah.
So we see that a lot with ASL interpretation, and we see that a lot with audio description services. And those are great. I am not saying don't do those things, but you have to have the budget to do them. And there has to be enough service providers to do those things, because there are lots of projects and lots of people that want access. But for example, I was told recently that there are approximately 300 ASL, registered ASL interpreters for the deaf folks within like the Metro Vancouver area. And that's not a lot.
Yeah.
VocalEye, which is a fantastic service. I also am the associate director of VocalEye, wearing another hat. But they're a fantastic service, and they provide live description for live arts and cultural events. Fantastic service, and they would come in and provide that service and a whole bunch of other access supports. But they have, 4 describers. So how do you do that work without, that organization's is hitting capacity, was what I'm saying, that the service organizations hit capacity. So what can the artists themselves do to say, okay, I have control over my project. What can I do to be creative about it? So here's some examples of creative access. So you can build in some description within your project itself. So, this happens all the time. We would call this like a low vision friendly or a low vision supported performance. And that essentially means that it's, easy to follow by dialogue alone, about 90% of it, right? So we know that we might miss a few things visually, but we're 90% followable by dialogue alone. That's because, you can tweak the dialogue. So instead of me saying, here, take this, I'm saying, here, take my umbrella, because as an audience member, I'd be like, oh, what are they passing? Right. So if you just say, take my umbrella, done. I know the description, right? You can provide pre-show notes in an audio format that I can access on your website. That would say, who the set is, what the set is, who the costumes, what the costumes look like, who the characters are, relationships, right? Yeah. Like a 5 to 7 minute audio piece. You can have each of the characters record that in their own voice, so I get familiar with their voices, right? There's all sorts of ways of doing this.
But really it just comes down to just involving folks, like involving folks within the disability community to join in on the experience. And yeah, as you just put it, even description just goes a long way.
It looks like nothing about us without us. There's a recent performance that I saw with open description. So essentially had a describer, and there are describers of all different levels. There are describers that are highly trained and highly competent in different genres, and then there are folks who are brand new to description, and then there are teams, artistic teams, who are like, you know what, I'm going to give this a crack myself, right? That would be a creative access thing, describing services like VocalEye would bring equipment to the show, right? So as a blind audience member, I would get a handheld receiver, which is about the size of a deck of cards, with a single earpiece. And I would wear that so I would hear the description in one ear and then all of the other music and dancing and dialogue in the other ear. And the audience would not hear the description that I'm getting. Right. But if you were doing open description, your describer or whoever you're choosing to do your description would sit at a desk with a microphone. And as your play is happening live, they would say, they passed the tequila, they blah, 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 they blah, blah, blah. So everybody in the audience is hearing the description happening. So that's creative access as well, right? Yeah. There's a staged reading that I'm working on right now, and we don't have the capacity to pay for CART services, so open captions, live open captions. Yeah. So we're trying this experiment of a open transcript. And because it's a live reading, it's pretty much low vision friendly because there's nothing to look at, right? There's no set. Each of the actors are going to introduce themselves and do an image description. And the stage directions are going to be read out. And the open transcript is just a copy of the script page. So the whole page is going to go on a projector. And for folks who want to read the page and follow along, they can do that. So instead of it being one line by line, piece of dialogue where somebody has to hit the next button for every line, which would, mean an extra tech person under union contract, probably another $1,000. because those things are required by theaters to have in place.
Yeah.
This can be done by the one tech person we have because it's not so much extra capacity to hit that button, for every line. They can hit it for every page.
Mm-hmm.
It's an experiment. And so that's how we market it to the audience, which is like, this is a creative access experiment. Let us know how it works for you.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work, we've given it a try. If it works, and then people are like, actually, it works pretty well, but you could, if you could make this font bigger or they give us feedback.
Yeah.
And then next time we try it again, which means we're doing access in a way that's affordable, that's easy to do. And the more easy and affordable it is, and I know that those sound like kind of the excuse markers, like, oh, it's too expensive and it's too hard to do, so we're not doing it. But the more like accessible we make it for those of us who are doing it, the more people want to do it.
Right.
And that's also important, right?
Yeah.
The more buy-in you get. And, I hate that we live in a world where buy-in is a thing, but there's a lack of resources everywhere and a lack of capacity everywhere. So creative access can look like anything you want it to look like. But that's me as a creative access thought leader. I come in and say, okay, what is the project? Who are the communities? What are the things that I know that have worked in the past? How, what's the goal of this? What do we want audiences to get from this? How do we get that message to them? And then think about all the different things that we have within our resource package, and what we don't have, and how we can like make this recipe and try and find something new. And sometimes it's just about seating, right? How do we make accessible seating?
Yeah.
All sorts of things. So for me, it's really fun because it allows me to be creative. It allows experiments. It allows trial and error, but it allows also to work with community, because if you don't work with community, we can potentially do more harm than good.
Yeah.
And it allows for relationship building with community, because you're doing with, and then the community is like, you know what? I like this. These creative people, I like what they're doing. They're involving me in their project. I'm going to stick around for their journey, and I'm going to come to every show because every show is different and unique, and they're involving me. And relationship building is one of the best things we can do with community.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's so beautifully put. I totally agree. And that part where you just said we're doing with instead of just doing for, I think is such an important part. In many projects and in many involvements when it comes to values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I think that the way you're doing this and the use of creative access, I've just grown to love the term creative access, because it is very creative, and I love that you see yourself as this creative access thought leader, because you so are. And just the entire process and hearing about it from this end, I think is already very enriching to know that there's already these measures taken or measures in place, and these projects that are coming to life. And it's just amazing. It's amazing to hear about this, and also it talks to your lived experience and also your experience in theater, which is actually one of my curiosities today about, can you tell us about the beginning of your love for theater?
Yeah, I'd love to. So that, I think I came out of the womb with a love for theater. I've loved theater and performance, and I have a very outgoing personality. So I've loved those things my entire life, as long as I can remember. My parents actually met doing Bye Bye Birdie in high school. And I don't actually think that my father was a big theater person. I think it was one of those things that he had to do to like boost his grades, and thought drama would be easy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
But my mother was a theater person. And then, when I was a kid, I had all this energy and I wanted to perform, and I used to put on my dad's oversized t-shirts and tie a belt around my waist, and it would, walk around like it was a tight, my tight dress, and I'd grab my microphone and I would sing. One of my favorite songs was Cyndi Lauper's "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." Literally top of my lungs, on repeat, over and over and over and over.
Wow.
And I think my parents kind of recognized that this girl needed to be in the arts. So at a very young age, I was put into, like summer theater programs or, weekend, every weekend you go to, theater class or whatever. And when we moved to Vancouver, they had this theater program for young kids. And I must have been, I don't know whether I was like 7, 8, something in that area kind of thing. And it was taken down at the local library over the weekends, and at the holiday time, we were performing the Charles Dickens, the Scrooge performance, and there were lots of kids. There were probably 20 kids in this class. Well, there aren't 20 characters in this performance, but you had a hat, right? So if you were Scrooge, you had the top hat, and if you were Tiny Tim, you had a little a tam hat or a crutch, and if you were Bob Cratchit, yeah. So everybody had like one prop as the identifier of the character, and so we would switch out. So you might have like 4 different kids playing Scrooge or 4 different kids playing each character, and we would just switch in and out and do our couple of lines as that character in each scene. It was really, really fun, except I had the ability of being able to remember multiple lines and multiple things of dialect. Like I had the whole play memorized. So I'd be sitting on the sidelines and there was no curtain. We weren't behind us. Like we were just all sitting at the side and we'd like pop up out of our chairs and jump on stage. Like it was so low bar, right? Yeah. So you could see me sitting in my chair, so excited watching my fellow like performers mouthing all the words of the show to myself, right? And I just wanted to get up there and perform. And so through my childhood, and then once I got into like elementary school, when we would write performances and put them on at our big local theater here in North Van, where I live, that was Centennial Theater. And then into high school, I took drama throughout high school, but we also had what we called the drama dungeon, and we had like a extracurricular drama program. So I was involved in that. And then so I just never stopped. It was my favorite place to be, was the drama dungeon. It was my favorite people to be with, my favorite world to live in. So I just loved it so much. I never stopped. I always wanted to be an actor. And when I experienced my sight loss at the age of 24, I really thought to myself, who would want a blind actor? And I thought that would be the end of that dream for me, because I never saw any representation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All I had was like Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman. And I was like, well, Al Pacino's not a blind guy, right? So it never occurred to me that this kind of thing could exist. And then I found Real Wheels Theater accidentally, because I was going to a described performance by Vocal Eye, and there were all these people with various disabilities in this show called Sexy Voices that they had written and performed with Real Wheels Theater about sex and disability. And I was like blown away. What? There are people with disabilities on a stage in a theater with an audience? How does this happen? Yeah. And then I got connected with Real Wheels Theater, and today I'm their board president and have been for the past 6 years. Very involved with the organization. Done professional shows with them. So like theater's just in my blood. It's in my blood. Yeah. It's really all I can say. Yeah.
And you've just managed to, and I really love and appreciate how even after that the eye surgeries that led to your vision loss, you found a way to come back to theater, and it was like meant to be. It's like one of those stories where it was just so woven into, as you said, like your DNA, and that sense of like aliveness that you feel. And also what I experience when you're talking about it, I just feel all this passion and this love for this art. So it's really just, it just makes me so happy, like just hearing this and how now you are paving the way for many other folks to be involved and to be part of this growing community.
It also gave me a real appreciation, my journey of sight loss, knowing what it was like to perform and sit in a seat in a theater without disability. And then when I lost my sight, sitting in a theater, which essentially was an expensive 2-hour nap, right? Because I had no idea what was happening on stage. It was so boring for me.
Yeah.
I couldn't follow the plot line. So, what are they doing? Like, I can hear the dialogue, but there were just so many holes in the story because I couldn't see what was visually happening. And we live in a sight-centric world. So to keep audiences interested, we often build in a lot of blocking imagery and things that aren't they aren't necessary for us to move, but we have to move because people get bored, right? Yeah. So we design theater in a visual way, right? And there's all these interesting visual light things that we do that tell stories and sound, it all comes together. So it was a 2-hour expensive nap. It's nice and warm in a theater and dark in a theater, and you find yourself falling asleep. Yeah. And that's when I discovered description through Vocali, and all of a sudden the access piece changed for me. So I also know what it's like to be in a space that's inaccessible and feel like, this sucks. I hate this. I used to love this. And now there's nothing here for me. Yeah. Why am I spending my money? Why am I doing this? Yeah. This is a place that I don't belong. And knowing how that sort of felt toxic to my soul, and how much I hated that feeling until I found, again, like rather accidentally, found this like soul affirming thing that allowed me this way back in. And then it was like, how do I tell everybody that this exists? And then it was like, how do I tell everybody with a disability that if you've never experienced theater and you've always wanted to, there's a way, and let's find it together. Because I just don't want anybody to sit on the sidelines and think that since they haven't been able to, that they shouldn't be able to. Because the system wasn't designed with us in mind. Well, let's change the system. Let's figure out how the system can work for those of us who haven't typically been invited in theater. Because once it's created for all of us, those who have the most privilege, they still get to access as much theater as they ever have before. But those of us who have typically not been invited into theater spaces also get to enjoy theater, and theater's meant for everybody.
Yeah. No, I'm honestly just in awe in how and in the way you say things and the way that they all come together, and just the deep advocacy and in everything that you share. I think it's so, well, obviously this is also your work, so that makes sense, but just knowing that it exists, and that at the same time that you're working towards these goals. And I think every time you work with an artist, it's like a step towards that. And even when these, like, for example, those creative access pieces don't necessarily work out, or like you get feedback and it didn't get as much, I don't know, like the greatest results or whatever, it's still like learning, and you're still you're still doing the work, and
there's value in that.
There is.
And when you do it with community, they know that you're thinking about the access piece, not like you're saying, oh, we've made this accessible, and it turns out that you haven't because you've done it for them and not with them. It's like, hey friends, let's try this and see if it works. It may not, and if it does, like, let's see how we build it. And if it doesn't, let's see what we learn from it. Are you willing to like take some free tickets and come on this journey with us? Right? Like, this is how we do it together. And we might find some really interesting ways of growing some really interesting, creatively accessible theater, which could be fantastic. And it also means that you could potentially find a lot of consultation positions for people who live with disability in the community who want to get involved in doing this work, right? Like, that's also a thing. We can provide work for folks in our community.